China and the global south, a developing influence and a shifting of the world order. Now, China is increasingly positioning itself as a leader and champion of the developing world. With efforts like the global trade development and the Belt and Road initiatives, it's expanding its influence in the global south, a part of the world that is changing in itself quite a bit. African countries are growing a bit more self-confident, and India and China have yet a different dynamic. Now, we're speaking with guests today about opportunities, dynamics, potential challenges, and what that all means in a larger context. Of course, with a focus on economics, culture, and other things. Welcome on DC to DHaka. I'm Nicolette Dividar. My guests today are Margaret Myers. She's director of the Asian and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue, senior advisor to the U.S. Institute of Peace, and adjunct professor for international business diplomacy at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. We also have Professor Mohammed Rahul Amin. He's professor and chairman of the Department for International Relations at the University of Dhaka. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming on. I want to start a little bit first on the larger perspective, and then we're going to zoom in. So when you look at China and the global south, where is the focus right now? What's the opportunity? And is there a particular order of area and interest? Margaret.
It's interesting. It's a great question, Nicolette, because as you said, things are evolving rather quickly. And I tend to divide the China. I look, at China's engagement with the world, but also specifically with Latin America. That's been my focus for many years. And I tend to divide the relationship up into, upwards of 4 or 5 different phases. It's changed so considerably over the period of time of enhanced engagement that we've seen from China in the region. China's been engaged in Latin America for over a couple of decades in this enhanced fashion, much more in the way of economic engagement. And back then, at the onset of this relationship, the interests were largely driven by China's own economic and, food and energy security needs. That's not changed all that much, but the nature of China's economic growth has. And so we've seen a focusing in different areas and different sectors over time to better align with China's own economic priorities and what is really a pretty critical need at this juncture to advance economically, to upgrade the economic output, and to be able to continue to grow at moderate rates. And so what we're seeing, I think, and this is not exclusive to Latin America, is, a focusing still on those traditional sectors of interest, agriculture, energy, for example. China relies very heavily on much of the global south, and especially Latin America, as a source of food production, especially soy. But in addition to that, focusing on sectors that are innovation related, right? That are related to those areas that China has prioritized both domestically and internationally in an effort to, again, upgrade its economy. And so this can include anything from AI, right, to smart cities and safe cities, to ultra high voltage transmission lines, to, equipment, higher end manufacturing. Really, urban infrastructure is included in all of this too. And this is called, in China, when you look at Chinese policy documents, there's a term that's been used to classify these sectors called new infrastructure. And so this is a really important development. Again, it's aligned with China's, economic objectives, just as we've seen for many, many years. But a really critical shift with, I think, really important implications into a wider range of sectors that are going to have transformative effects on the region and other regions as well.
Yeah, and I actually want to dive into the sectors a little bit here in a moment, because I've noticed that is an important point. Now, Professor, what is your take? Can you give us, from your perspective, where you're sitting, China relationships with the global south in terms of interest areas? Now, let's talk regions here for a moment. Is there a particular order? We heard from Margaret about Latin America. What about other areas? What's the prime focus right now? Would you concur? Would you see it differently?
Yeah, I guess Ms. Margaret Myers has correctly pointed out on the rising influence of China vis-a-vis global South when they are calculating their interests in their foreign policies. I would like to talk about Chinese influence from the perspective of changing global relationship between the global South and global North. And if I can correctly recollect, that after the post Cold War period, when at the end of the Cold War, when we entered into the post Cold War period, and we have seen the changing role of China in international relations. And now, once there was China was considered as a country located in the south and in the developing world, and now with the declining American image in international relations, we see the China's rise. So there is a debate whether China is declining or China's is coming in front of international relations. So that's a very big question. And by now we see from economic point of view and from political point of view and from also military point of view, China has been in a position to compete global masters like the United States of America. And the way that global relations with China is now shifting, the evolving pattern and characteristics of China global relationship give us a clear idea that China is coming with a big leadership. Now, if we look at Chinese interactions with the global south, it's amazing that Chinese influence in global south is changing over the years. And at one time, China was creditors nations and debtor nations, and now China is giving credits to global south. And the global trade, once that was dependent on the aids from the United States of America and European countries, and even the development of global south once was developed dependent on the global north, and now has shifted that the dependency of global south has been increased when it is coming to evolve the relationship of global south with China. So now global south has started to depend more and more on Chinese aid and trade assistance and development assistance. If we look at the infrastructure perspective, if we look at development perspective, if we look at even education like artificial intelligence, in all sectors of development areas, we see that Chinese influence in global south is increasing day to day.
Yeah, let's talk about what kind of projects are we actually speaking about. So are these all large scale projects? Are they now more targeted? What is the front runner, so to speak, the first three most important sectors that we see where China is actually investing? And then in which countries, possibly, if you can, are they putting their priorities on right now in the global south?
Right. So, I mean, this is a really critical question in terms of understanding how things are evolving. I would say, I mean, to the professor's point, you know, there's more to this than investment, right? There are trade relations involved. There are financial flows, which were alluded to, right? Which were a big part of the story. You know, 10 years ago, we don't see so many major loans to, at least to the Latin American and Caribbean region right now. But it's a lot of different forms of economic engagement. And so if we're talking about economic influence, right, we have to take all of this into account. If China is your top trade partner, plus a major source of investment in growth promoting sectors or sectors that a country has prioritized given its growth objectives, then that naturally will lend China a considerable degree of influence, even if it's indirect influence, right, over policymaking. As concerns your question, what are the priority sectors at present? Still, as I said, some of these traditional sectors of interest, agriculture, energy, continue to be, a fundamental part of China's overall, investment portfolio and trade, of course. But even within those sectors, we see some interesting shifts, right, toward a more innovation-related focus. So, for example, in the agricultural sector, it's moved from a focus on purely logistics, insertion across the supply chain to ensure transport security and the provision of resources and avoid disruptions, right, in supply. But now also a more extensive investment in, for example, agrochemicals, in seed technology, in certain manufacturing that is supportive of agricultural development. So it's a shift again in this direction toward higher end production, higher end manufacturing, and overall economic upgrading. Same is happening, obviously, in the energy space. What used to be a lot of oil and gas investment is now, and we still see that. We still see a lot of trade in oil, right? So that's not something of the past, but a lot of oil and gas investment, equity investment in oil fields. Now we see a lot more, as we all know, right, focus on renewables. And that's a big part of the story globally. To the detriment at times, right, of industries in other parts of the world, for example, in the EU and the United States, who have tried very hard to compete with China in this space and have found it very difficult to do so for a wide range of reasons. But so there's that. And then beyond that, if we're talking new infrastructure, right, where are we seeing these deals happen? They're happening increasingly at the local level because these are smaller deals overall. And they are, again, sort of tech or innovation focused deals. So if you're doing a safe cities project or a smart cities project, you're going to be doing that project with a city. You may need the approval of the Ministry of Interior, for example, or something of that nature. But a lot of these agreements are being struck at a very local level. And that's sort of a new and emerging phenomenon. It's been happening for a number of years, but we're seeing it happen with increasing frequency. They're smaller in scale, but they're part of what China has called not only new infrastructure, but small but beautiful projects, right? And so this is the point is to do smaller projects that generate a quicker return on investment.
Now, Professor Rahul, let's talk for a moment here about perception, because you mentioned that China's influence is growing in the global south. We all know that. And actually, there was a survey, I think it was Pu, actually, research, who brought out the perception of China in the global south is obviously very different than the perception of China in the global north. In fact, the numbers were, YouGov did it actually, 57% of Saudi Arabia and Egypt expressed a positive perception of China's role in the world. 59% Mexico, 50% in Brazil, Kenya 82%, South Africa 61%. Just to give sort of a note. What is potentially a different approach, as you see it, from how China approaches the global south versus how, for example, Western countries have approached it?
We see that when our experience with global north is giving us the idea that global north has always followed the structural perspective. So structurally, the more the global south was receiving financial assistance and package from global north, the global south was making themselves reliant and dependent on the global north. So the more they were receiving their aid or financial assistance, the more they were becoming poor and poor. So instead of making them elevated and develop, the approach that the Western approach that was implications, that was implied to fine-tune the relationship of global north with global south, it was absolutely based on the realist paradigm. Only the northern countries looked at their own interest by sacrificing the interest of many of the global southern countries. But we see that the Chinese perspective, Chinese approach in terms of morals, in terms of theory, in terms of structure, in terms of paradigm, in terms of philosophy is quite different. China, being a country of the global south, always takes care of the global southern countries with spirit, with philosophy, with togetherness, with sense of belongingness.
Margaret, what's your take on this one?
I take the professor's point that China has, been very adept at engaging with the global south on a sort of equal platform, noting that China has had in many ways a similar development experience, understands the conditions in a lot of these countries, understands how to engage and potentially to promote development. Again, it's a sort of China development model, largely infrastructure driven and based on, or manufacturing driven, for example. But I've yet to see, considerable evidence after the fact that what China is doing in terms of engagement, in terms of investment, even trade, is significantly uplifting these countries economically. Time will tell, of course, right? But it may very well be the same. So to the same critique of global north interaction with these countries and engagement and development assistance and everything, I think may very well be applied to the China case as well, right? There is engagement, there is investment, there are projects, there are things happening. But what really are the outcomes? And part of the problem is that there aren't a lot of good in-depth case studies on these things, right? How much employment? How much permanent employment? How much employment, but then how much environmental degradation as a result? Is this a project that's sustainable? What's the quality? These are the questions that have to be asked and studied in a lot of depth. And they have been in certain cases in when we're talking about Western development institutions, international financial institutions, they do this work, they do this due diligence, and it is publicly available. So we have a sense of what has worked and what has not. In the China case, it's far more opaque. And I would say, there are some really clear differences between the way that China engages and global northern institutions and or international financial institutions based in Washington and elsewhere, right, have engaged. One is that, China will engage across the board with any countries, right, regardless of of political dynamics. That has been interpreted positively by many members of the global South, not as much by others. Certainly, the United States and then others, partner nations, have had deep concerns about that and the prospect for enhanced corruption or for the dissolution of democratic institutions as a result of funneling of finance and investment flows to countries where things are happening that are not ideal from a sort of governance perspective, right, or rule of law perspective. Also, the agreements tend to be more opaque. So it's just much more difficult to know what precisely is being negotiated, what is happening, what countries have agreed to, and whether that's in their long-term benefit. And it's not just difficult for all of, the external observers. It's difficult for those in the country who are stakeholders, right, or ought to be stakeholders in these projects to actually know what's happening. So the degree of opacity, it depends on the structure of the deal, obviously, but it's there still in a lot of cases and makes it difficult to evaluate these projects and their overall outcomes, right? And then finally, I would say that more than other countries potentially or donors or investors, China relies very heavily on the countries themselves to ensure that these investments generate benefits locally. And maybe that's fair, right? But when you're investing in countries where or delivering large loans to countries where there has not been a record necessarily of efficient use of these funds or of of consideration of the effects on wide-ranging stakeholders, that can have in some cases deleterious outcomes. And so we've seen that in certain cases. In some instances it's been beneficial, and other instances money has simply disappeared into the pockets of those who are in the leadership in various forms. And so it's different. It doesn't mean that China isn't a critical partner, economically speaking, but it means that a lot of the onus is indeed placed on governments in these countries to make things turn out right, and that sometimes works out well, and that sometimes does not work out well.
You both actually brought up a really interesting point, and you mentioned that before as well, Professor Rahul. You spoke about dependency of those countries. So really what I've heard both of you say, though, is so there's a level of dependency of the global South, either on the global North or in China. Now, if we zoom into a little bit on the dependency part, what role does this actually play in the global South, where you have a lot more countries developing a different type of, I would say, a little bit more self-confidence? You see this definitely in Africa, in a lot of ways, actually, where and also in Latin America, I guess, as well. People are becoming a lot more self-confident and say, wait a minute, so we want to claim our place at the table, etc. So where is that sweet spot where we say we can actually reduce dependency, and I know this is pushing both of you probably a little bit, where we can reduce dependency a little bit and go more to an actual reciprocal trade without all the shackles, if there is an answer to that?
I think it's been a challenge, right? I look fairly exclusively at the Latin American context, right? But the trade dynamic is such and has remained as such for many, many years now, right? That the region is primarily exporting primary commodities, right? Agricultural goods, metals and minerals, things of this nature, to China. And China is exporting increasingly high value added products, just as we discussed, right, to the region. This has not fundamentally changed. There have been discussions about this, serious discussions that have taken place, which have resulted in more in the way of manufacturing investment in certain countries. And also efforts to open China's market to a wider range of goods, potentially, processed manufactured goods, for example, soy meal instead of soybeans. But none of this has fundamentally altered, right, the equation to date. The one, way in which countries can negotiate more effectively on their behalf is to do so together. And to do so potentially through the mechanisms that China has established for regional discussion. So there's something called the China CELAC Forum. There's the FOCAC in Africa, for example, where countries could potentially use that time and those platforms to push for a more effective and symmetry building trade relationship with China. At the same time, I do believe there is, as you said, a greater degree of confidence among many members of the Global South, an effort to push through the BRICS and other mechanisms, a Global South agenda, and to uplift, right, many of the concerns of Global South nations, which they feel have not been well represented in traditional international fora. And so, China has been integral in this process, and of course, others have too, the original members of the BRICS, for example. So we'll see how and if a lot of these considerations are addressed, and then how they are addressed among the nations of the Global South, including with China.
I'm not sure whether global dependency of Global South on China will be much more dangerous than their dependency on global northern countries. I'm not sure, because the trend has already been started, and we are experiencing a new dimensions in international economic relations. But you see, if we look at the Cold War period, and if we look at the pre-Cold War period, and if we really recollect the text written by John Edelman Sparrow, International Economic Relations, then we see how dependency was a drastic problem for the global southern countries when they were interacting with the global northern countries. And so global South being totally frustrated, and I would say disturbed by their interactions with the global North, nowadays has turned their focus toward China. But I'm not sure how the future years and future days will give feedback to these global southern countries. And coming back to your examples taken from Africa, by now I see that more and more Chinese aid are instrumental in African setup and infrastructure, energy, even education. In all these sectors, Chinese financial assistance is very active in their relationship with Africa. And even if you look at my country like Bangladesh, we see the major infrastructure development are now funded by China. If you look at BRI project, and if you look at Chinese Silk Road initiatives, and if you look at their bank like Global Development Bank, then all these things. So for development, you need two things. One is infrastructure, another is financial package. And in China, started focusing on these two dimensions equally. I think the dependency syndrome of global South on China may not be disturbing as it was with the global North.
Now, one thing we haven't talked about that, and this is the debt situation, which is also, I suppose, always a vulnerability for those who loan money to other countries. And since China has invested so heavily, for example, in Africa, I mean, the investments went from 10 billion in 2000 to 282 billion in 2023. There's also an exposure to, there's a risk, obviously, an exposure to risk in certain countries with the debt situation. Where do you see that going forward, Professor?
I don't think that will create much problem, because if you look at Sri Lankan case, for example, we see there was debt trap with Sri Lanka. But in what sector there was a problem with Chinese aid? In fact, it was in their in the projects that were mainly dependent on the Western oriented linkages. So I don't think that the Chinese assistance in Africa and the Chinese huge investment in other countries of the global south may create some kind of debt trap problems with China, because China by now has resolved these issues, and the issues that may create bottlenecks between the interaction of China with the countries in the global south. And China may be developing their strategies to win over and to fine tune new models of adjusting with the change situations, so that they can minimize the risk and challenges of that can spring from this perspective, and they will have a very solid foundation of understanding their relationship and building their relationship with global southern countries. For example, if you see when Bangladesh and India being very neighboring countries, and there was a PAXA problem for Bangladeshi policymakers, how to balance between China and India when they were interacting economically and politically even. Then Bangladesh didn't have any problem to combine between China and India.
Margaret, your take?
I mean, this question of this debt problem, right, is, in my view, just as much a problem for China as it is for some of the countries that carry a heavy debt burden. And, I think, as has been alluded to, this is not a problem for all countries in the global south, right? There are a handful of countries, if we look at the Latin American and Caribbean regions, for example, that have taken a lot of loans from China. Obviously, as the professor mentioned accurately, right, this is not just a China problem. There are a lot of loans. A big part of the debt is also from other institutions, including Western institutions. The issue is that in a lot of these cases, there's some high interest debt from China that's coming due right now, at a moment when, it's a precarious sort of overall financial and fiscal situation. And so what happens then? And I don't know that China has the answer to that. I don't know that these countries have the answer to that. I'm thinking, for example, of Dominica, where Chinese debt represents a very large share of overall GDP and is coming due now. I'm thinking of Ecuador, where there are still several billion owed to China. There was an effort to sort of renegotiate the terms of those loans, but essentially it has sort of kicked the can down the road a few years, and both countries will be grappling with this situation in a matter of about 3 years again. So this will be something that China is going to have to continue to think about, to revisit, and it's not exclusive, as I said, to those two countries. There are a lot of countries where this is happening, and it's leading to an overall debt burden that that China has, that the policy banks, China Development Bank, China Exim Bank are carrying, and that have led to a major restructuring of the financial institutions in China to try and manage what they perceive as a quite critical problem, in addition to major domestic debt issues that China is facing. So it's an issue. It's one that China's going to have to grapple with, and that has additionally led to a rethinking of the Belt and Road Initiative. We're not seeing these big loans anymore. There's a reason for that. It's because it's not sustainable, right, for China either. So, the way that we're seeing engagement is, as I said, through mostly investment, right, and investment in these smaller projects that generate a quicker return on investment, where you're not going to have these big issues with debt that we've seen in the past associated with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. Final words for both of you, and the very last question. Final words, make it brief. We talked a little bit about the competition aspect of China and India and the United States and so on, but competition really is sort of like a typical pillar of the paradigm of the last century, so to speak. As we talk about the paradigm shift, I want to shift a little bit towards the future. Where do you see opportunities for collaboration if we leave the competition, if we at some point ever overcome the competition aspect and it goes more towards collaboration? Where do we focus? What's the sweet spot?
You see, we now live in such a world where, as I already said, that we are thinking whether we are moving towards a critical theory perspective or problem solving theory perspective. China has come to the forefront of international relations from critical point of view, from critical perspective. And China doesn't want to make a reform, absolutely, but China wants to challenge existing international system. And the way that China is rising and China is coming to the front of international relations gives me clear idea that China is coming as a leader of future international relations. Now, we see the international system started from Pax Britannica, then we saw Pax Americana, and after the new trend of changing global relationship, we're not sure whether we're moving towards Pax Sinica. We see also Pax Japonica. But if the word Pax is very dangerous, I don't know how future discourse of international relations will take shape. If it will be based on the Pax ideas, then it's dangerous. And Chinese leadership role will be much more dangerous than United States of America and then possibly other countries. But I see if India, China, United States of America, they avoid their hegemonic stability tendency. So the thing that we need, and these three countries, the big countries and possibly other big countries of international system nowadays, must think of the future world. And future world must be a global village where mutual cooperation and, as you say, reciprocity is very important. And for reciprocity, for coordination, collaboration, we need the change of our mindset.
Margaret, you got the final word.
Sure, I'll be very quick. I mean, I appreciate your optimism, Nicolette. I really do. I hope that there will be more opportunities for collaboration, and just of the sort that the professor has described. I do see, I mean, frankly, I do see a couple of sort of low-hanging fruit areas for China-US cooperation. That is in climate, right, where we've seen some interest at the very least, right, and more cooperation bilaterally. But a lot of what China's doing in terms of climate cooperation in Latin America, for example, and what the US is doing is quite complementary, right? China focuses on adaptation through infrastructure development. US focuses very differently on skills building, on all kinds of other forms of engagement that are also quite critical, but are very different. And so, I mean, to the extent that those differences, but which are complementary, can be capitalized on, I think would be wonderfully beneficial, right? And absolutely fundamental at this particular juncture. On health, right? Also absolutely critical. On security issues that many of which, there is a common interest. These are not going to be easy things to achieve in the current political environment, and things may get even harder depending upon the outcome of upcoming elections. But there are, and it is incumbent upon us to think about how to work together more efficiently and effectively to address what are really pressing and existential global challenges.
Thank you very much for both of you for coming on. Thank you very much also for our viewers. As you see, it's a very complex issue actually, but I do believe that once we identify a little bit the sweet spots, there is also some areas where really things can improve. On that note, see you next time.